Right now, Israel and Iran may or may not be at peace. We're not really sure. After 12 days of intense aerial bombardment, drastically spiking tensions, and the largest stealth bombing run in world history, the Middle East's two bitterest allies have done the one thing that nobody expected. Just hours after ballistic missiles rained down onto an American military base, and as the city of Tehran was still being battered by Israeli air power, the nations agreed one by one. First the US, then Iran, and then finally Israel confirmed that they would lay down their weapons and bring an end to an undeclared war that has rewritten the fates of the Middle East. But like everything in this conflict so far, the reality was a hell of a lot more messy, and right now it's still an open question whether the Middle East is headed to a lasting truce or to a phase of war that will make the last 2 weeks seem a bit like child's play. It has been an absolutely crazy 24 hours, so here's what happens, here's what we know, and here are the lingering questions that we still have yet to get answered. Look, even compared to the day-to-day insanity of life in the Middle East since June 13th, what happened on Monday the 23rd is something truly special. But before we can get into the details, we have to be clear about timing. Everything that we're going to discuss in this episode is accurate to the best of our ability as of 9 o'clock in the morning. It's 8:35 when I'm recording this, so this is going to be Tehran time? June 24th, local time in Tehran. There we go. At that time, missiles have only just stopped falling across the nation of Israel, and there are no guarantees that the ceasefire will hold until the time you see this episode. But as of right now, it seems as if the situation is about to get as stable as we're going to get. And if the realities on the ground do change dramatically, then, of course, we'll be back to cover it, won't we? At the start of the day on Monday, it seemed as if this particular day of the Iran-Israel crisis would unfold in roughly the same manner as the days that had come before. Israel would continue its aerial campaign against Iran, Iran would launch volleys of missiles into Israel, and now the entire world would wait to find out whether Iran would also retaliate against the United States after a series of airstrikes severely damaged Iran's nuclear facilities. And for most of the day, Monday played out pretty much as expected, until it got to about dinner time in the city of Tehran. As the day had gone on, fears began to spike that an Iranian retaliation was imminent. The United States began to prepare its people in Qatar, where substantial American military assets were stationed, for what they suspected to be an incoming strike, while Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the Emirates all closed their airspace. Finally, as the evening went on, Iran launched a series of 19 ballistic missiles targeting an American airbase called Al Udeid. Qatari air defenses roared to life in response, launching interceptors and bringing down a total of 18 of the missiles, while the last one was allowed to impact an empty building close to the airbase. Qatar and the United States confirmed that there had been no casualties as a result of the attack. But as information about Iran's retaliatory strike began to emerge, it quickly became clear that not all was what it seemed. Rather than targeting several of the many American military bases scattered across the Middle East, the missiles had gone after just Al Udeid. Instead of being paired with a drone swarm that could have temporarily overwhelmed missile defenses in the area, the strike consisted of only a handful of ballistic missiles in the sort of attack that Qatar's American-made Patriot air defense systems would have been expected to stop. And the strike had been directed toward an airbase where American warplanes had largely been dispersed weeks ago, long before America even entered the conflict directly. Then, news emerged from sources in Qatar that Iran had reached out to the nation in advance to warn that an attack was inbound. And finally, America's president took to social media to explain that Iran's strike had been little more than a well-manicured fireworks display. As Trump explained the situation, and we'll quote him here, "I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody to be injured." By America's counts, by Qatar's, and as the hours wore on eventually with the confirmation of Iranian sources, the attack on Al Udeid airbase was meant to achieve two things. On the one hand, it was meant to provide enough red meat to Iran's internal hardliners that they'd be at least somewhat placated, with Iran, of course, claiming to its own people that it had successfully retaliated against America. On the other hand, the strike was calibrated to ensure that America knew it was an empty gesture, ensure that America didn't have any reasons to retaliate, and thus leave America a path to make a graceful and easy exit. Not only had the US known about the attack, but American and Qatari officials had met at least a day before to plan the specifics of their upcoming missile interceptions. All in all, Iran appears to have calibrated an even less escalatory retaliation than its 2020 response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani, choosing to explicitly target an evacuated base to ensure that even the traumatic brain injuries that some US soldiers suffered from Iran's 2020 retaliation wouldn't pose a problem this time around. It was a far cry from the all-out war that Iran had promised in the wake of America's strikes, and it opened the door for a transition to what Trump called online, and we'll quote again, peace and harmony. Trump also said in his classic all-caps style, "Congratulations, world, it's time for peace." Much to the surprise of observers who had assumed Trump was being a bit overly optimistic, it would only take a couple of hours for discussions of peace to begin. Indeed, if Iran struck America's airbase in Qatar around dinner time, then Iranians were in for a hell of a surprise when they got up for a midnight snack and, much like the rest of us, checked their phones as they did it. By that time, Trump had announced online that, quote, "It has been fully agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire," all caps, "in approximately 6 hours from now when Israel and Iran have wound down and completed their in-progress final missions," exclamation point, for 12 hours, at which point the war will be considered ended. Again, all caps. I feel like I gotta point it out because it's just strange to read a head of state posting this way, even now, so many years later. Decoding from Trump speak for anybody that's not fluent, thank you so much, Evan, who wrote this piece, Israel and Iran would wrap up their strikes within a period of about 6 hours, so midnight on the 24th in Washington, or about 7-ish in the morning in Jerusalem and Tehran. Then, Iran would abide by ceasefire conditions for 12 hours, presumably while Israel was at liberty to continue its strikes, and then, after those 12 hours, Israel would abide by ceasefire conditions too. Assuming that both sides got to 24 hours, that would be that, and the Middle East would be at peace. Now, we do have to acknowledge here that that's a pretty strange way to go about a ceasefire, and according to reports from the White House, many of Trump's senior advisors didn't know about the arrangements until Trump put out his post on social media. But although the weirdness of the whole thing led to a range of defense experts to speculate that Trump was bluffing, news quickly started to emerge that there really was something going on behind the scenes. According to sources interviewed by Axios, Iran had reached out to Qatar after its strikes a few hours prior and asked Qatari officials to pass along a message to America that Iran was done with its attacks. America wrote back and asked Qataris to pass a note saying that they didn't plan to retaliate and would happily restart nuclear negotiations. Those back-and-forth messages then started to focus on establishing terms, and in a direct call to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Trump was able to bring Jerusalem on board. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi took to the airwaves to state that Iran had forced the West into a ceasefire deal, and although Iran's supreme leader posted online that Iran would refuse any ceasefire terms, that appeared to be the latest in a long line of examples of the supreme leader's public statements not exactly matching the actual intent of his government. As more details emerged, it became clear that Israel and Iran had agreed to stop striking each other at 4 in the morning local time in Tehran. As the moment of truth came closer, it appeared increasingly unlikely that the ceasefire was actually going to hold. Israel continued its bombing of Tehran and actually appeared to intensify the attacks, striking all across the city with some of the most relentless airstrikes thus far in the conflict. By appearances, they seemed to be trying to get as many final strikes in as possible before a ceasefire took effect. Iran launched ballistic missiles toward Israel, although it didn't score any hits, with those missiles being intercepted in midair. But as the clock ran down to zero, Israeli warplanes turned back from Iranian airspace, the flow of Iranian missiles petered out to nothing, and a long-awaited silence simply fell across the region. As the fighting wound down, Trump spoke to press in Washington about the diplomatic feat, and when asked how long the ceasefire would last, he offered, quote, "I think the ceasefire is unlimited. It's going to go forever." Now, unfortunately for the man in the White House, forever turned out to be about 5 minutes. Despite Iran having declared a ceasefire and announcing it to Iranians on national television, the nation launched a small wave of ballistic missiles toward Israel after the ceasefire was supposed to have taken effect. At first, the missiles seemed as if they might have been a mistake, or the consequences of Iran's command and control being so thoroughly degraded that a military unit or two might have gone rogue and launched missiles by themselves. But once they were intercepted, alerts went out across much of Israel that another barrage was on the way, this one larger than the one before. Air defense systems went into action again as rumors spread that perhaps the ceasefire deadline had shifted. During the second wave of attacks, A missile broke through Israel's air defenses and crashed down to score a direct hit on a residential building in the city of Beersheba. 4 people were killed in the strike and 3 others critically injured, but that death toll is expected to rise by the time that you're watching this episode. Smoke was still rising in Beersheba. Another missile alert went out, warning Israelis that a third wave was incoming, this time targeting most of the country. Again, this was after Iran had already announced a ceasefire on state television and just minutes before the initial deadline that Trump had proposed. All the while, Israel still held off on officially announcing a ceasefire. And over in Washington, the messaging coming from the White House consisted of social media posts by Donald Trump written as if the ceasefire was holding, but published while missiles were in the air. And yet, after the third wave of strikes, Iran seemingly waited for the Israeli military to announce an all-clear before sending a 4th round of missiles on their way. After the 4th, Iran launched a 5th. Each salvo was intercepted, with the final interceptions taking place just about 5 minutes before Trump's initial deadline was meant to take effect. At midnight in Washington, D.C., Trump's deadline passed, and all went quiet again across the Middle East before the Israeli military sent out alerts to warn of a 6th missile salvo inbound. Speaking to Israeli media after Iran continued its strikes past the deadline, the Netanyahu government is now considering its options in order to decide on a path forward. Iranian state media claimed that the 6th barrage against Israel had been launched before the ceasefire began and that the ceasefire should now be considered to have taken effect. But whether Israel's still interested, that remains to be seen. Now, at the time of writing, Iran has yet to launch a 7th barrage toward Israel, and how the next several hours go is likely going to determine whether this ceasefire is actually able to hold. According to the arrangements that Trump laid out, Israel now has a 12-hour window in which they're able to strike Iran, while Iran must abide by the terms of a ceasefire. Iran's foreign minister has framed his nation's waves of missile strikes as continuing, quote, until the last minute, suggesting that Iran does now intend to keep to the ceasefire as Trump laid out. But whether that actually happens is anybody's guess. Israel now has the deaths of at least 4 civilians to account for, with those deaths taking place in a hazy period that may or may not have been understood by Israel to be a part of the ceasefire. How Israel reacts to those deaths and Iran's broader conduct over the prior few hours may dictate the scale of any Israeli strikes that take place in the coming hours. And depending on the magnitude of those strikes, Iran may quickly lose its appetite for a ceasefire deal that demands that it sit quietly and waits while Israel has 12 hours of free reign. Beyond the immediate implications of the next 12 hours, there are other burning questions that must be answered before this crisis can be declared over. Perhaps the most important of all is the status of Iran's command and control infrastructure in this stage of the fighting. While it now appears that Iran's latest missile barrages were intended to be launched by the regime, there were early concerns that rogue units of the Revolutionary Guard Corps might have been responsible, even though that does not appear to be the case. This time, there's a real possibility that units could go rogue in the future, acting in protest against the ceasefire and potentially dragging Israel and Iran back to war. Of course, that assumes that the two sides can keep a ceasefire at all, but if they can, then Iran will need to quickly assert control of its military units, while Israel will need to find some way to determine the difference between a state-sponsored act of aggression and a provocation by soldiers who may not speak for Tehran. Whether either nation could do what's required in that scenario is far from guaranteed. On the subject of discontent with the regime, it'll be important to watch the reactions of the Iranian public as closely as possible now that a ceasefire has been declared. A large portion of the Iranian population are bitterly opposed to their own ruling regime, as has been demonstrated by several massive waves of protests in the last few years, and those anti-regime sentiments aren't about to go away just because Iran has declared a ceasefire. But now, the ceasefire risks inflaming tensions between the regime and a part of the population whose support they desperately need. Iran's hardliners might respond to the ceasefire by accepting Tehran's narrative that it's forced the West to accept a deal after battering Israel and America into submission. Or they could just as easily turn on the regime for its perceived inadequacy and failure to project true strength in Iran's time of need. In that latter scenario, with the nation's hardliners and its anti-regime activists united behind a common cause, the prospect of regime change may start bubbling up to the surface of Iranian public consciousness. That is an especially troubling prospect for Tehran when we factor in hardliners from the military who may have the means to stage their own coup attempts while Iranian forces are in disarray. Then there's another series of attacks that took place in the territory between Iran and Israel. On Monday and early Tuesday, military assets in Iraq came under attack from explosive drones targeting radar, Iranian bases, and even a base where US troops are located. Those attacks aren't thought to have come from Iran, and although a perpetrator hasn't been officially named, the likeliest suspects are the range of Iran-backed militias that are active across Iraq and Syria. For those militias to take action introduces a dangerous wildcard into the situation, especially given that they attacked at a moment when their benefactor seemed ready to enter a ceasefire. All across the conflict, there are so many other questions that have yet to be answered. For Iran, those range from the status of its enriched uranium to the extent of the devastation at its nuclear facilities, to the survival or death of its supreme leader in hiding, to the strength of its remaining military forces. For Israel, there are a range of implications to consider, from the political fate of Benjamin Netanyahu if a ceasefire does take hold, to the question of just how badly its weapon stocks, and especially its air defenses, have been depleted. And of course, there's the biggest question of all. Can this ceasefire hold even until the time you see this episode? Can it even be called a ceasefire at all? The answers are going to come with time, and once we know more, we'll be back here to cover it. And until then, thank you for watching.